Welcome to Love Yourself So Matcha,
the podcast where we get up close and personal with mental health issues.
In each episode, you will learn more about eating disorders, body image, self-love, and appreciating yourself.
I'm Cindy.
And I'm Lily.
And we hope that you will join us on our journey to loving ourselves so matcha.
Hello, everyone. Yep. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of the Love Yourself So Matcha podcast.
For today's episode, we have another very special guest, Miss Keez.
Welcome, JL. We're so excited to have you with us today.
So, Miss JL, do you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Yes, certainly, ladies. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be on your podcast this morning. Well, it's morning for me, late afternoon for you, and I'm really honoured to be here with you, ladies. So, yeah, a little bit about myself. My story is actually a very, very big story, but just to convey it overall, I went into anorexia nervosa at the age of 15, and I experienced that through until I was 24. Because when I experienced an eating disorder, there wasn't much information about it or even a diagnosis about it, because I'm of an older generation who sort of went into eating disorders before they were even really acknowledged or known about. So for those 9 years, I developed those behaviours. I restricted my eating and hid what I was doing and everything. And I think my mother did try to seek some help with doctors, but with the lack of knowledge and awareness at the time, nothing really came to fruition. But at the age of 24, I was then married and I was teaching in Victoria. I live in South Australia, and I had been married and I shifted over to Victoria. And one of my teaching colleagues wanted me to go with her to her doctor's one day. And I was a bit puzzled as to why she asked me to do that. But I went along anyway, and in my session, and she came in with me, she and the doctor sort of presented to me that they felt concerned about me, and she obviously saw something in me that was upsetting for her to actually witness and watch. So as a result of that, I was then referred to a psychiatrist, and that was the beginning of my undoing in a way, because he handed me some paperwork on anorexia nervosa, and when I looked at it, I could see that what I was reading was exactly what I was doing. So I finally found a diagnosis sort of through a back doorway in that way. But in reading that document, I was also very, very afraid and very fearful. And I was acknowledging that fear was just a huge entity in my life at that time. So I then went ahead and under his guidance, I ended up in hospital, I ended up on medication, and I ended up really being bullied into putting the weight back on. And it was a very difficult process because of the way it was handled. And even though I did put on the weight, what then took its place was a lot of associated illnesses, which we would call mental illness in this day and age. So I then went on to suffer chronic fatigue and migraines and OCD and depression, which finally turned into suicidal depression, and an experience called depersonalization, where I didn't feel like I even existed or was on the planet anymore. So that was my background, very in a nutshell, about my experience with it all. And it wasn't until I was 38 years old, when my marriage sadly fell apart and I was now a single mother, that I happened across a lady called Joan Hookstad here in Adelaide, and she practiced reality therapy underpinned by choice theory. And she was the first person in all of those years that I met that began to make sense of my story and began to work with me. And that was when my true recovery really began. So that's just a little bit about myself, sort of the process of being an anorexic and then going into mental illness and then meeting the lady who would help me move forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. Actually, I feel like I've never heard of eating disorders contributing to other mental illnesses, and I think that's a really great point. So that's something to really think about. I actually am also curious, what's your backstory to becoming an eating disorder therapist? How did you get into that field?
Well, it wasn't my intention, but once I met Joan and began to learn how she practiced and what she worked with, I became very interested in it because my journey, I guess, along the way, because you're so desperate to find an answer as to why your body's not working properly, you do go down many, many pathways, and you meet a lot of people, and a lot of people who are in the same boat as you, not necessarily an eating disorder, but another illness of some sort. And we're all banding together, trying to work out, what's gone wrong and why our bodies don't work properly and why we live in fear and all of those things. So, and reality therapy, choice theory really offered that guidance and the solutions for all of those questions that I was asking and the people that I met along the way. So with an interest in that, I went and became a certified reality therapy therapist, and not really with the intention of going into eating disorders, but really just wanting to understand it so that I could, because I found it was also helpful in parenting. I had 2 children by now, and I learnt that I was repeating the patterns of what I went through. So I certainly didn't want to do that. So I was cleaning up my act as a parent. I also was a secondary school teacher, and I could see the value of reality therapy and its approach in assisting my students in the classroom. So that initially was the pathway that I was taking it down, just to add quality to me as a person, me as a parent, and me as a teacher. But then as the years went by and people began to really get to know me and understand my background and my story, I was encouraged to write my book and to write my story as an inspiration and a guidance to other people who had suffered. So during the process of writing that book, I was then encouraged to move forward and perhaps work in this area as well. So that's what I decided to do. So last year I set up my online courses, my online programs under the heading JL Keez, Anorexia Unlocked. And I wrote 7 different programs, and all as an online outlook. I sort of sat down and looked at me at the age of 15 and thought, well, if I went back to being a 15-year-old, what do I think now, with everything that I know, would assist others? What information can I impart? So that was the beginning of it. And now in this year, I'm just beginning to bring, day clients, as I call them, rather than just the clients in an online experience. So it really was at the encouragement of other people, seeing the wealth of information and wisdom that I could share. Yeah, and can I just backstep a little bit to what you said in terms of eating disorders and mental illness? I think that they share, that foundation and that framework. Eating disorders to me are a form of a mental illness. I think there's something mentally going on for that person, which manifests itself into an eating disorder. So I think there's a very strong link between those two.
I definitely agree that I think eating disorders is also a form of mental illness.
Yes.
So another question we have is, as an eating disorder therapist, what work do you do? Or maybe a little bit more specifically, like, what is reality therapy?
Yeah, I really like that you've asked me that question, because I think it's really helpful for people to hear about this. And of course, it's the one that I really support. I like to be able to share it. So reality therapy is a therapy that William Glasser, who was an American psychiatrist, developed many, many years ago. And he, from all the work that he did, he began to rearrange, the therapies that he was working with and come up with a solid one that he felt was really viable to help people. So reality therapy asks clients to look at the realness of their life, hence the name reality. And so in being able to look at the realness, they're being asked to look at their thought processes. So what thought processes do they have which are contributing to the development of this eating disorders? So Joan began to look at my thoughts, particularly around when I experienced fear or anxiety or headaches, what thoughts preceded each of those experiences for me, and could give clues as to why an eating disorder was in my life. So we looked at the thoughts, we then looked at the behaviours. Okay, you had that particular thought. What behaviour came about as a result of that thought? For example, if I walked into a room and I felt like people didn't like me, because that was part of my dialogue, which took me down that road that no one would like me, I would see that straight away. So one of the behaviours that I adopted was to very quickly read the room and work out what sort of person I felt I needed to be accepted by the people in this room. So I would change my behavior. I would change the way I would stand. I would change the way I would speak. I would change the way I would relate, what I would talk about. And it became pretty automatic over a number of years. And we had to unpack that, unlock that, and see why why I couldn't just maintain who I was. We then looked at my emotional load and what my emotions were teaching me about me and my life. We then looked at all the physical symptoms and what are the physical symptoms telling me about me. And once we unlocked and did all of that sort of work, alongside of that, we looked at my values and my beliefs. What value system and belief systems were I living, and were they actually the values and beliefs that the real authentic me carried, or were they values and beliefs imposed on me and therefore didn't really suit me, but I felt compelled to have to live them? We also looked at wants and needs. And the big one, I think the cornerstone to all of it was the relationships. And so Joan got me to look at my relationships with my parents and with other people throughout my life that had had a huge influence on how I lived my life. And when we began to look at those relationships, we found a lot of clues and reasons as to why an eating disorder would turn up at the age of 15. So there was a lot of work to do, but a lot of discovery along the way. So really, in a nutshell, we were looking at my story. So from the time I was born through to at this age, 38, what had my experience of life been, and how was I filtering this thing called life? How was I living it? And therefore, what changes were necessary for me to be able to get back to the authentic person that I was. So when I'm working with clients, that's the pathway that I set up. So the programs that I've written, and I think some clients who access my programs go, hang on, this is not what I was looking for, but it actually is, because I guess it's my belief and what I've been through. I tried everything else and this was the one that worked for me. So that's how, as an eating disorder therapist, I work, and that's what worked for me. So thank you for the opportunity to share it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and kind of along the lines of environmental factors and
Yes.
thoughts affecting behaviors.
Yes.
What are some things that trigger people with an eating disorder, and some things that we should absolutely avoid saying around somebody who may be dealing with that?
But once we're in the eating disorder, I think unfortunately it's up to the person who's experiencing the eating disorder. And this is where you said, you know, you'd be fine and then you'd get triggered. In therapy, they are those little pearls of wisdom that you take back to your therapist and say, look, I was going really fine, and then someone said this comment and this is what it was, and bang, I went back to starving. And, you know, that's your little pearl of wisdom that you can work on for you. But for people around someone with an eating disorder, first of all, they need to really take that step and that responsibility, particularly if they're parents or their family people. Like, I need to find out for myself what I need to do, what responsibility do I have in assisting, you know, this daughter or this son of mine or this relative or friend or whatever. So one of the things to avoid is actually talking about food and weight. That's the biggie, because even though food and weight is the thing we're doing, it's not really about food and weight. That's the offshoot of having an eating disorder. But all conversations around food and what we eat and how we eat and why we eat and all the rest of it need to be avoided, unless the person experiencing the eating disorder asks for it to be a form of conversation. Then don't talk about your food. Don't talk about weight either. Don't talk about body image. Don't talk about being a perfectionist or your achievements at school, or whether you got an A or whether you got a B, or anything around achievement. That needs to be avoided for the length of time that that person has an eating disorder as well. Don't highlight, don't bring to the foreground and attention in a room the fact that you are aware that this person has an eating disorder. That, you know, don't even highlight it as a point of conversation. Anything to do with that area of food and weight needs to be avoided at all costs. And that's taking responsibility and caring for that other person. So that would be the biggest one in answering that for you today.
I think that summed it up really well. And I think that our listeners who might be around people who have eating disorders will really gain something from this. So another question we have is how do you approach someone who has an eating disorder about recovery? Because it is kind of like a sensitive topic for them. How do you suggest to them that they might need to go through recovery?
Okay, I guess sort of in a way that was done for me. I think, when that teacher, and I was a home economics teacher, so, I was teaching food and nutrition every day as well. And so was this other teacher. And she was actually pregnant and she was going for one of her pregnancy appointments. I thought, well, why would she want me to go along with her? But we had the sort of friendship. I thought, oh, look, I'll go along. Maybe she needs a bit of support through this pregnancy. I'm not really sure. So she sort of handled it by not actually talking to me. She didn't ask, do you think you've got an eating disorder? Do you even think you've got a problem? She just made a suggestion to go along to a doctor. And it was a really good way of handling it, because next thing I ended up in this doctor's room with him. And he obviously, they must have talked about it before I entered that room. So then he was prepared with the right questions and the right tunneling, if you like, to bring it to attention. So he knew how to do it. So I guess if, we are around someone, so that was sort of a professional way of doing it, I suppose, in a way. But if you have a friend who you think, hang on, this person's really changed. First of all, their weight's changed. I can see that they're getting picky with their eating. I can see that they're getting upset about and things like that. The only thing that you can do is to go to that person, and I would do it privately, certainly not with other people around witnessing this at all, but as a one-on-one, go to that person and say something like, I'm really concerned. I really, really value our friendship, and I really, really value you as a person, but I'm noticing some changes in you lately that are a little bit upsetting, and I wonder if you're okay. And because I'd like to help you if you're not okay. And if that person gets defensive straight away and says, I don't know what you're talking about, just no, and they walk away, don't labour on about it, let it go. You've sown a seed, let it go. And then perhaps down the track again, you might give it another shot. Or what you might do, if you're in a school setting, you might go to the school counsellor or one of a trusted teacher. Or you might go to your own parent and say, look, I'm really, really concerned about so-and-so. This is what I'm noticing in that person. What do you think would be the right line of approach? And go and educate yourself about how to, meaningfully connect with that person, so that first of all, they trust you. And once they've developed a trust in you and you're not being pushy, you're not bullying them into anything, they're more likely to open up to you. So I would then leave it for a little while and then approach it again and say, look, I really, really care and I'm really noticing these things. Is there something upsetting you? Please trust in me. I'm not going to share this information with anyone unless you give me permission to do so. You're always looking for their permission to go to the next step as well. So, I would just keep asking them. And if that doesn't work, then you might bring, information that you've gathered and just pop it all in an envelope or something with their name on it and put it in their locker at school, or, just hand it to them and say, look, this is out of care that I'm giving this envelope to you. And then they'll take it away and they'll open it up and they'll see, like I did, I saw all these pictures of me, I saw all this information, and I couldn't avoid it then. So that's just a couple of tips. I guess it's different for everybody. And as a therapist, I guess for individual cases, you need individual knowledge so that you can better direct somebody. But those couple of hints might be helpful for your clients today that are listening, or your listeners rather, that are listening to your podcast today.
Yeah, I definitely think this will be really helpful for our listeners who might have friends or family that are suffering an eating disorder right now. Now, like for our listeners that might be suffering from an eating disorder themselves, what do you believe are the best forms of recovery for a patient? If a patient feels the need to seek recovery, what would you recommend?
Well, to that one, I'm going to recommend someone who practices reality therapy and choice theory, or as you put it, environmental factors. Once somebody has decided, look, I've got a problem here and I'm acknowledging it and I need to go and get help, first of all, do your research. First, let's just step back. First of all, do you know anybody else that's had an eating disorder that you could go to and ask questions of? Like you had an eating disorder, you have it now, what helped you? And get some information, start to do your research, because that person that you initially connect with is a very pivotal and important person in your life, and you want to get it as right as you can. And as eating disorder people, we tend to be perfectionists, so I'm careful in saying that. As right as you can for the time, but always go with your gut feeling. Is this person the right person for me? So start your research via other people who've already walked the path before you, and take from that those things that seem to suit you. Then Google these people. You know, we have that available to us these days. Google the different people that have been suggested to you and have a look at how they work. What work do they do? What line of inquiry do they take? And does that sound like the line of inquiry that you need? Do they have knowledge of eating disorders? How long have they worked in this field? Do they acknowledge the need of nutrition? Do they know that they have to do the cognitive work as well as the nutritional, as well as the exercise work? You know, how broad is the area of work that they are offering to you? Do they acknowledge that there's a few lines of inquiry that need to be gone down? So from the patient's perspective, do your homework and then feel what feels right for you. But I would strongly, strongly suggest that if that person isn't looking at your life story and isn't looking at your thoughts, behaviours, emotions, and your physical symptoms for clues, then that's probably not the right pathway to go down, because they are really valuable indicators that will give you a wealth of information that you can learn from, but then ultimately grow from as well. So that would be my greatest hint for listeners today.
Yeah, that's really helpful information. I kind of wish I knew that when I was trying to recover from my eating disorder. But also, we've been talking a lot about environmental factors today, and that has a lot to do with reality therapy. But we're often surrounded by our families, friends, or even for my case, it was a lot of my coaches and people that were in my sport that affected the way I thought about my body. How would you recommend those people support somebody through recovery? What are things that they can do?
Oh gosh, that's the big one, because unfortunately, once we find ourselves in this situation of having an eating disorder and we begin to learn about it for ourselves, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that everybody around us is doing the same work to support us properly. And sadly, a lot of people think they know what they have to do. They think they know, but they don't actually know. So I did listen to your podcast where both of you, Lily and Cindy, share your stories. And so those coaches that you had and those prominent people around you, I think for all those people that go into those arenas, there needs to be set up in their learning before they even present themselves as a teacher. Because eating disorders are so prevalent. But it's not only eating disorders, it's anxiety, it's fear, it's those other presentations of mental illnesses. I'm at the point where, and I see it as a school teacher because I still do relief work, you know, most days, and I see it in the younger generation, and it's not anybody's fault. It's a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge. I think it's a program that needs to be undertaken by everyone who goes into this arena so that they can learn how best to deal with eating disorders, how best to speak to people, how best to connect with people who are in high performance sports, as you two girls were. I was too, I was an athlete. You know, what is their role? And once they see an eating disorder unfolding in front of them, they need to step back and take responsibility for some of the words that might have spoken that triggered this off, but they need to go and do their homework as well. So in terms of bringing it down to family and friends, they either exit your life for a while or they decide to go on the journey with you and do the learning that you're doing so that they can learn the right way to be for you, which ultimately will assist them in relating to people generally just in the world around them, not only just with the person who's experiencing an eating disorder. So it's a time for everyone to get educated about the topic, which I really bang on about, is how we relate impacts those relationships, those connections, the words that we speak, and the way we treat each other are pivotal in any illnesses that do generate in this day and age. That's my belief. So I don't know how you change it in terms of sport. We're having that here at the moment with our swimmers. are really coming out and speaking their truth about what they've experienced, and it's pretty appalling. But until the people that are doing that are really willing to listen to the role they're playing, we're going to be uphill a bit. We can only really do it for ourselves. So I hope that's been helpful in that answering.
No, that's really helpful. I think that really relates to, I think, both me and Cindy, our own experiences. I wish there would have been a way to stay in the sport while still recovering. And I think the world is slowly changing and obviously moving towards more body positivity, which is really awesome to see. But for myself, I had to completely step back from skating for almost, I would say, like almost a year and a half now in order to fully recover. And now I'm completely fine being out of that environment and being around completely different people. Hopefully I can go back in with a different mindset, but it's really opened my eyes, at least, to how how much pressure is put on the way we look or the way we should think. And it's not always a positive thing.
No, it's not always easy. And I'd just like to pick up on that word that you just said, and it's mindset. It's the mindset that takes you one way or another. Because if you go back to your skating days, and the other young lady, Cindy, isn't it, was a dancer. My daughter is a professional dancer, and she went into, and she's taught in it. She's worked around the world and all of this in this industry. And she could see that if she continued in ballet, she was going to go down the eating disorder road. So she got out of there pretty quickly. But she has continued in all other forms of dance. And now she does lyra as well. And she does acro, and she does a whole range of things. And she's not impacted by an eating disorder. So it is the mindset. If you look at those girls that were around you, some of them developed eating disorders and some of them didn't. And it's that difference of why one did and one didn't that gives you the answer as to why one developed an eating disorder and one didn't. So there are plenty of dancers that survive in the dancing world, and there's plenty that don't. And it all comes back to mindset. And mindset is the outcome of what life has taught you and what your family environment has taught you, your cultural environment has taught you, your school environment, all of those things, and why you became susceptible to an eating disorder, whereas somebody beside you didn't. And it's that thing called mindset. What's set up in your thinking and how you're filtering the world around you, that ultimately makes the difference. So I just wanted to really pinpoint that word because it was an important one, I felt.
I definitely think that's really insightful. And I think that will also help our listeners who might be struggling with eating disorders, like to know that mindset is one of the biggest factors contributing to their eating disorder. We had one more question, but I think we should have asked this earlier. So how do we know whether or not, or how does a patient know whether or not they need inpatient treatment?
I'm a bit divided on this one. Inpatient treatment is for people who require medical assistance. You know, their weight has dropped so low that they need intravenous drips so that nutrition can get into their bodies so that they can hydrate. When they've got to a weight that is threatening their life, now they need to go into inpatient treatment, absolutely, utterly, and for sure. But as long as that inpatient treatment also deals with what we've been sharing this morning, Lily and Cindy, on here, I just want to go back and reference my experience with that many, many years after I'd come out of the eating disorder, but I was still suffering from all of these other illnesses. I ended up here in Adelaide in a place called Flinders Medical Centre as an inpatient. I'd been an outpatient for a long time, and that did absolutely no good because I now know that the right questions weren't being asked and the right pathway set up for me. But I did go in as an inpatient. And when I went in, this is what I mean about listening to your intuition. I knew that I wasn't there. I wasn't going to heal. This wasn't going to create recovery, but it was going to give me knowledge. So for 10 days, I went into this environment, and it was really, really interesting because I connected with other people who were living the same experience. And I saw how many tablets they were taking, and I heard their conversations that they were speaking. And I began to, and I took reality therapy in with me, that knowledge, and I began to see stories unfolding in front of me that hadn't been explored. before. And so these poor people were still held in their eating disorders. One young lady said to me, I'm fine when I'm in here. I'm great. I put on weight and, you know, I'm happy and everything. And then as soon as I go home, it all falls apart. This is the third time I've been back. And that was a real highlight for me when I went, okay, so if she's back here for the third person, then why aren't these psychiatrists making that connection between her home environment and her eating disorder? You know, if she's okay in here, what's not in here with her? It's a home environment. So I came away from that experience going, you need to heal in the real world, because it's the real world that is creating or contributing to your eating disorder in the first place. And you need to be in the real world so you get triggered, so you can talk about those triggers, so that you're not avoiding those triggers. And that young lady needed to be there, and then she needed the right therapist to say, okay, this is upsetting. Someone said that, right, let's really have a look at this for you. But once she got into hospital, all the problems and issues went away, so they weren't able to talk about anything. So I don't believe in inpatient. I think that you need to heal in the real world, and you and the people supporting you need to go on that journey with you of discovery and learning and all about it, and support each other accordingly. But inpatient, absolutely and utterly necessary if you are at a life-threatening point and your doctor makes that decision, and you and the people around you make that decision as to whether you're still functioning. If you can't function, you're in hospital. If you can function and you're still going to school and doing most of what you can do, then please heal in the real world. And that just comes from my experience, I suppose. So that's what I'm going to support.
Actually, that's a really interesting point, and I might check out reality therapy because I've never heard about it. But I know that for me, my eating disorder is a bit more recent than Cindy's. Hers is like quite long ago, and mine, I just got out of it early last year, I would say. And obviously I'm fine now because I'm mostly in quarantine, but I talked this with one of my other friends who also has an eating disorder, who also used to have an eating disorder. And we talked about kind of being worried about going back into the real world because that would end up triggering us if we're back in that same environment. So yeah, I never really thought about actually recovering there. So that's a very interesting thought process.
Can I just respond to what you just said? If you do go back into what you're saying, the real world, when lockdown and all of this craziness leaves our lives and you go back, then could you take the mindset with you, instead of being afraid, you and a friend being afraid, instead of using that in your dialogue, I'm afraid of what's going to happen when I go back, go, I'm really looking forward to going back into the environment, because if there's any fine tuning for my eating disorder, there's going to be triggers. And instead of being afraid of them, when they come along, embrace them, acknowledge them and go, hang on, I'm getting triggered here. All right, I need to write down what I'm thinking. How's this affecting my behavior? Emotionally, what is it doing to me overall? What physical symptoms? Is there a pain in a certain area of my body? Is there anxiety all over? Is there fear? What is it? And then you've got a little pearl of wisdom that you can take with you to your therapist or to whoever you talk about this with, and say, look, I had this experience the other day. I think I need to do some fine tuning on my eating disorder. Could you help me with this? This is what happened. This is how I responded. What am I doing? You know, how can I do this differently? What in my mindset needs to change so that this is no longer an issue for me? So I wonder whether that might be a really positive way of approaching going back into what we call the real world. So don't be afraid, embrace. Is it uncomfortable? Yes, it is, but it's an uncomfortable that will give you rewards in the end. And then when you come to the end, always give thanks and then look forward to the next one, or it might be the last one. You just don't know. I mean, even at my age now, every now and then I get far out. I've gone back to triggering. It doesn't affect my eating or anything. It's just an acknowledgement of, oh, why am I worried about what that person said? Oh, and I can very quickly unlock it and go, oh, far out, I've gone back, nah, and then move forward. It's not a problem. But because I've learnt the fine art of accepting, embracing, working it through, and null and voiding it in my life. So I just felt it important to perhaps give you that little hint.
Yeah, that is so helpful. I will definitely look into that and try to fix some of those behaviors myself. But Yeah.
That was really good. Miss Jael, you had so much insightful information to share, and I think this is really helpful.
Yep. So if we're heading for the end of our podcast, which ladies I've really enjoyed, thank you so much for having me here with you. I would like to just really highlight what I do. And that's not because, I want to push my business or push me into the world of eating disorders or whatever, but it's been a frustration of mine for a long time. Having eating disorder, girls around me or boys around me, and parents in particular, and the unwillingness, I guess, to really look at what's really going on, and how I've outlined reality therapy to you today. And even with my online programs, I see some people access the free program and then they don't go any further. Some do, some don't. And I'm wondering if it's because those that don't, this idea that I've presented here this morning might be a bit foreign. And I'm wondering whether they expect to see talk about social media, counting calories, diet culture, and all of those things. They to me are symptoms, and it's important to acknowledge them and address them. However, that is a symptom. I want people to go back to the core reasons. And so all of my programs have set up with my story, excerpts from my story, and then how to understand who you are, but more important, why you are. Why are you as you are at the moment with your eating disorder? So I really encourage people, as you said, Lily, before, I wish I knew about reality therapy for me. I'm encouraging those with eating disorders to take that step and really go through that free program and realize it's more than food and weight. And the ideas that I'm presenting there are the very ideas that I finally come to understand were the most helpful. So, yeah, it's just, I want to get that message out to please look at your story, look at the indicators in your story. They're all there. Don't miss them. Because you owe it to yourself to unlock and undo all of that. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely make sure to check out JL on all of her social media platforms. Do you want to plug any of the other platforms or anything that you want to plug?
Well, if people are interested in finding me, I'm at JL Keez, and K is spelled Keez rather, K-E-E-Z. To get it right, otherwise you're not going to get there. So jlkeez.com.au will take you to my website, and it will take you to all the programs and everything. It will tell you about who I am and why I'm doing this. It will also give a link to my book, which I published last year. It's just going through a revamp at the moment, so hopefully it's a better quality product for people that would like to source that as well, and it tells you there how to source it. My Instagram handle at JL Keez Anorexia Unlocked. Those two are the places social media wise that I engage with at the moment. And of course, through Facebook, I have a Facebook public page, JL Keez Anorexia Unlocked. And through that, you can join a private group where it's just for clients and myself to be able to engage with each other and support each other on their journey through and out the other end of an eating disorder. No, it might be good to go onto my website and have a look at my media kit, because in there you'll find other podcasts that I've been a guest for. And one of them you'll find, ladies, is Harriet Frew, who you've just had, the lovely Harriet from the UK. She's such an insightful and wonderful lady, and I enjoyed listening to your conversation with her. And yeah, and other avenues, because listening to podcasts, what you two ladies are doing, it will give you insight, it will give you information and connection, and start to open doors for your recovery. So yeah, I think I've shared everything about me now as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really hope that everyone learned something from listening to our conversation with Miss JL today. And yes, I'm going to repeat, please reach out to her if you're interested in anything that she does. She's really great, and I would recommend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening.
I hope everyone loves themselves so much and more after this episode.
Stay tuned for our next episode. Updates will be posted on our Instagram and Facebook. Both handles are @LoveYourselfSoMatcha.
Also, make sure to check out our website, which will be linked in our bios.
Bye!